President Trump held a business dinner last night with a group of high-profile CEOs at his New Jersey golf club. That's where he touted his administration's economic successes.
If you're from this country, you're loving what's happening. Through tax cuts, deregulation, powerful trade policies, and unleashing American energy, where we're now the largest in the world, we're taking our economy to incredible new heights.
And while the president says the economy is stronger than ever, New York Magazine argues Americans are still reeling a decade after the Great Recession. The article, called "In 2008, America Stopped Believing in the American Dream," takes a closer look at the financial crisis' lasting impact. And with more on this, I want to bring in Eric Levitz or Eric Rich? Eric Levitz.
Eric Levitz.
Okay, yeah. Eric Levitz. He's the associate editor of New York Magazine's Daily Intelligencer and contributed to that article. Sorry, because I saw something here that said Rich, but that's okay.
Oh, that's all right. I helped with the editorial process. The article was written by Frank Rich, who is one of our writers.
There you go. Thank you. So this is really depressing. You sort of go through kind of the reality of what we're dealing with, what our savings look like, what our 401k looks like, what millennials are feeling, how they don't sort of feel hope looking forward, and baby boomers are concerned that they're never going to be able to retire because they won't have enough money. And the article argues that this all started with the Great Recession. Explain.
Sure. Well, actually, I think that the Great Recession is the moment when Americans sort of lost faith that this dream was going to be recovered. But I think one thing the article intimates, and that I would argue, is that this dream has sort of been in decline for decades.
Yeah.
I think when we say the American dream, you can define that a lot of different ways. But I think core to that is the idea that this country is a land of opportunity where anybody who works hard and plays by the rules can achieve a baseline of material security for themselves and a better life for their children, while those who go the extra mile and develop special skills or are born with special gifts will be able to rise in society no matter where they're born, and make great contributions to our country. And this is called the American dream and not the American reality for a reason. We've never fully achieved that. But decades ago, in the post-war period, when we had high growth rates and when workers collected a much larger share of economic growth, we were much closer to achieving that. We had higher levels of social mobility. It was more likely that you would move up. And social mobility was declining for decades before the Great Recession. Labor's share of productivity, which is the amount of economic growth that goes to workers rather than investors, was declining since the late 70s. Middle-class wage growth was tepid for decades, while the costs of housing, higher education, and health care were all skyrocketing. Before the Great Recession, before 2008, these trends were mitigated by the fact that middle-class, especially middle-class homeowners, had access to constantly rising house values, which gave them home equity, and then also easy access to credit because lending terms were so easy. What the 2008 crisis did was it ripped those things away like a veil and sort of revealed the state of middle-class decline that was being camouflaged sort of by this easy money.
I think, a lot of people might look at the 9/11 attacks as sort of a moment in our history where things shifted for us, where it was sort of the life before the 9/11 attacks and life after. That attack happened a good decade before the recession. Why not that as a pivotal point?
Right. Well, I think when we're looking at these economic aspects of the American dream, I think it makes sense to focus on 2008. That said, I think that obviously the September 11th attacks were an enormous trauma for this country, and I think especially its effects on. If you look at, for example, like Arab Americans or Muslims, they were voting for both parties or many Arab American Republicans before the September 11th attacks, and many Arab Americans were sort of coded as white. We didn't have the amount of Islamophobia that we have in this country right now, and I think that 9/11 and the trauma of that experience helped spread a lot of divisions and racialized divisions in the country that we might otherwise not have encountered. That said, it was ultimately an attack by an external enemy that for a brief period united Americans against it. The 2008 crisis was a crisis of our own society, of our own economic structure, and the government's response to it really revealed the way in which, a lot of the things that, maybe if you were struggling in the American economy in 2007, maybe you had a sense that, this is ultimately the product of natural forces, of free markets, that this is something that no one is deliberately, giving me a raw deal.
Right.
Whereas the crisis hits, and you see this situation where actually no, we're not a free market economy. These major financial houses that participated in reckless behavior, they were insulated from the bad effects of their behavior. Their executives collected billions in bonuses, while underwater homeowners were left to drown in their mortgages. And so I think that the trauma of that experience, the loss of faith in America's institutions that exacerbated, I think, is somewhat distinct from September 11th.
Yeah, one of the very things that we celebrate here, the free market, was actually working against us. And only actually not working against everyone, but certain people were getting more of a raw deal than others. So, we mentioned millennials, that they're finding it tougher and tougher to achieve the lifestyle that they grew up with, what their parents had at the same age they don't even think they could get close to. And 72, let's read this statistic, just half of millennials believe that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world. 72% of their parents' generations, the baby boomers, think the same way. What has shaped the millennials' point of view over the years? Why do you think there's such a difference between the two generations?
Yeah, well, I think there's a vast gulf in the opportunities that have been available to millennials relative to baby boomers, especially, I guess, from a certain class segment. Now, obviously, there are portions of the population where this is different. I think for a lot of millennial women are arguably, going to have an easier time getting into careers than many of their boomer parents, and African Americans. It's a much more open society for those who are able to make it out of these really incredibly segregated and disadvantaged communities and make it into the professional world. But for the generation as a whole, boomers were able to go to college that was heavily subsidized, that did not cost very much money, and were able to, if you had that credential, there were relatively few college graduates as far as the population was concerned than there is today. You very easily could get a very good job, you could get a very affordable house, and you could build wealth through that. Millennials are graduating with enormous amounts of student debt. The best jobs in the country tend to be in cities like the one we're in right now, where the real estate market is out of control. It's become a way for global investors to store wealth, and housing prices are through the roof, so you can't. A lot of your money is going to go to rent each month, and you're not going to buy a house. You're not going to build wealth that way. So there's a very big difference in terms of opportunities. And then the last thing I'd say is that the millennials' coming of age has been, I think, defined, especially if you are a typical millennial, which tends to be a bit more liberal. You've had the national security crisis of 9/11 during your puberty years, basically. You had the 2008 crisis in college, and then you had what many millennials would regard, based on polls, as the political crisis of President Trump's election in 2016.
So let's talk a little bit about the political crisis, because you talk about the fact that the mood is dire. There have been all sorts of editorials written about how divided we are as a nation, and you sort of contrasted a little bit to after President Obama's first election, the buoyancy. This is what America stands for, and blah blah blah. And certainly those who are critical of the president might point to him as an individual who is contributing to this dismal feeling. But the article argues something different. Not so much contributing, but maybe exacerbating something that was already there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the country was deeply divided under Barack Obama, and it's important, to have some perspective that in the subjective perception of Donald Trump's core supporters, he has revived the American dream. If you look at polls before and after the 2016 election, consumer confidence, is this country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Is the economy going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Very little has fundamentally changed in the trends of the economy, the actual material ones, since Donald Trump's election. It's been a steady sort of upward trend for many years now. But for partisan Republicans, it just skyrocketed their reported view of how the country was doing. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. But it is the case that for the broader country, his election was a trauma and brought to the fore forces that were already very much in operation during the Obama presidency.
Eric, I need you to give me something to believe in. I mean, do we just throw the American dream out, or do we move to Canada in order to achieve it?
Yeah, I think, if for viewers who, are on the liberal end of the spectrum, I think that there's a lot of hope to take from the fact that, both in reaction to Trump and in part Trump was a reaction to this, this country has never been, if you look at polls, more positive about immigrants in relative to other countries. Right now, I think there was a recent poll that showed about 67% of Americans saying that immigration was a force for good in this country. White Americans have never, while there's still a ton of racism in this country, the levels of reported racism or racial resentment are lower. And also, because of Trump's victory, there's been a real explosion in political engagement from a lot of people who were passively dissatisfied with the way their country was going, but when someone is charismatic to them and likable, as Barack Obama was putting the brand on, what the situation was, they were able to really sort of passively tolerate it. And now that Trump has stamped his somewhat more garish brand on the situation, they're activated. And so I think that all of those things, are a source for hope if the climate doesn't kill us all.
But Eric Levitz, thank you very much. Thanks for that little gray cloud.